Hello, welcome to Microeconomics, McConnell, Brood, and Flynn. We're going to go over Chapter 1, Limits, Alternative, and Choices. This will be a pretty brief but somewhat thorough presentation of the first chapter. This is meant to supplement the work you're already doing, not to take place of an actual lecture. If you're online, just use it to support what you're already learning. As always, make sure that you read the textbook, go through any practice and other supporting material that may be available to you, or if you're just doing this because you just happen to enjoy economics, we welcome you. All right, let's get to it. And for those who are studying, I will be occasionally reminding you of the slide that we are on and also what page we are in your textbook. Our objective today is to try to define what economics is and explain it from an economic perspective, the roles and the theories, distinguish macro and micro, positive economics and normative economics, explain individuals' economic problems, talk about trade-offs, opportunities, and a combination between the two on a budget line, resources, scarcity, and list some of those. And we'll also, last but not least, towards the end, get around to the idea of production possibility and talk about growth in international trade. All right. First off, let's talk about the most obvious part. What is economics? Well, it's actually a social science studying human scarcity. What do we mean by that? We have unlimited wants but limited resources. The primary limiting resource happens to actually be time and then money. A good example, you get concert tickets to two of your favorite artists, but they're at the same day and at the same time. Well, if I'm paying for the tickets and I'm going to pick you up in a limo and provide you with food and everything else, you just have to tell me which concert you're going to. So how do you decide who do you want to go see? That is one problem with economics. And you also notice that it is a social science. Some colleges it's in the business school, sometimes it's in the liberal art. But since we're studying humans and how they react to scarcity, generally we consider it a social science. It's not a hard science or a natural science. Slide 4. From the economic perspective, and we are all the way on page 2 in your textbook. We have to understand and decide scarcity. You don't have unlimited time, you don't have unlimited financial resources, so you have to make decisions. What is the opportunity cost? Pretty simply, when you have something, you give something else up, that is your opportunity cost. The next best option is what you've given up. We'll also talk about utility, a fancy way of saying, hey, you derive some satisfaction or pleasure from something, and marginal cost versus marginal benefits. How much does one additional unit worth to you? My favorite example is that in a short sentence is pizza. Let's say you like pizza. The first slice is great, especially if you're hungry. But if I provide you 4 whole pizzas, you're probably not going to eat them all, not at one sitting. Therefore, the next unit doesn't have as much benefit to you, so you're not going to consume it and it'll be worth less. Scarcity in resources. What do we mean by that? Again, we don't have unlimited resources or unlimited time, so how do you make the best of what you have? You have to make decisions. In that last part, no free lunch. Everything you do has some type of cost and a trade-off. If you're in college, you've traded off sleeping in and working because you're looking for better opportunities with a college degree. So there are the trade-offs. There's no free lunch involved. Purposeful behavior. We're under the assumption that everyone is making rational decisions. We all have that friend or family member. You look at them and you don't think they're making rational decisions, but from their standpoint, they are. And when we make those purposeful behaviors, again, what utility or satisfaction do we get from it? Businesses primarily are working in the idea of profit. Primary reason people study economics is to try to understand the business world, and it's a little bit further, but it is there. And you're trying to reach some outcome that you find desirable. Now, later on, you may look back and say that wasn't the best choice, but at that given moment, it was the best choice for you. As we discussed, marginal benefits. How much does the extra unit cost you? Is it worth it for you to eat the additional slice of pizza? At some point, you're going to make yourself sick. You're not going to eat 4 whole pizzas. So, the marginal benefit of satisfying your hunger, the first slice is pretty good. Again, probably slice 4, slice 5, you're a big eater. Yeah, it's not as pleasurable. So the marginal cost starts to outweigh the marginal benefit. In economics, it is treated as a science. What we do, and we'll get around to this towards the end of the chapter, is we discuss how, like most scientific methods, this works. And towards the end, we'll talk about some of the flaws that you may face. Most of the time, science starts from the aspect of you look at something, you take a guess at what you think it is, then you go test it. If it is something that is repeatable, you can say that it is an acceptable theory. Until then, it is pretty much just a hypothesis, just something you believe is. You try to modify it if it doesn't match up, and you continue to redo the process. The reason it is not a hard science is you're dealing with people, and if you repeat the experiment, they may not behave the same. So it is a study of humans in a social aspect. Just some basic principles about economics. And we're all the way floating around on page 3 or so. What we generally assume is ceteris paribus, all things being equal. It's Latin. So, in our basic premise, we're trying to find out what 1 or 2 things are actually causing an event. By that I mean everything else stays the same, but we change one little bit, and we'll see if that is the catalyst to get this other events moving. You have a car, it's pretty much not going to do anything until you actually turn on the ignition. Modern cars don't even need a key, but back in the day, you had to put a key in the ignition, and that little bit was the actual thing that got it started. So all of the things being equal, without the key, you're not going anywhere. Now it's that lovely little key fob. All right. Moving along, we're on page 4 now, slide 10. Economics has a lot of subcategories, but the 2 large categories happen to be macro and micro. Micro, you're studying an individual, an industry, a small community, or something of that nature. Macro, you're either studying the entire economy worldwide, or you're studying an entire nation. We're going to be studying large groups, so that would lead us to Mac, as in Big Mac, micro as in microscope. Or we'll be discussing all of it in aggregate or grouped all together as one unit of measurement. And these reflect one another. You need a lot of individual data to get the macro data and so forth and so on. Now, when we talk about economics, there are 2 aspects of it. Are we talking about a factual statement, which is positive, or a normative statement, which is your judgment? This one's one you can keep and use in almost any debate. You can ask the person, are you providing me some positive statements, or is it a normative or your narrative? Realistically, your value judgments and positive statements don't necessarily become the same thing. So you have to watch out for that. People are talking about economics and you're paying attention to the news, hopefully, you'll realize there's a huge difference sometimes between what is reported and what you should interpret from that information. Economic problems, as we discussed, limited resources, limited income, unlimited wants. So you have to decide how you want to actually make some trade-offs. You can't have your cake and eat it too, so what are you giving up to get something else? You have to actually make some type of choices. You're here. If you are in college, again, you could be sleeping, you could be working. Perhaps you could be out mowing the lawn. You could be doing a lot of other things. But if you're in class, you've made the decision that long term, it's worth more to you to get the degree than the other choices involved. And that possibly will have a change in your income, hopefully for the better. Now, we're going to give an illustration of trade-offs. Combination of just two goods. And here we have t-shirts and books. For the sake of argument, you get a gift card. Start a new job, excellent work, and the manager gives you a gift card worth $120. There's a store down the street where it's a gift card to, and they sell books and t-shirts only. All the t-shirts are $20. All of the books are $10. Now, as you can see, if you wanted to do nothing but buy t-shirts, you could only get 6. If you wanted to buy nothing but books, you can get 12. The trade-off comes in if you decide you only want 11 books but 1 t-shirt. The ratio doesn't work in your favor. If you want a t-shirt, you have to give up 2 books. And there's your trade-off. In this instance, a t-shirt is worth 2 books. On the other end, if you give up a t-shirt and there are only 5, you can get 2 books. But if there's only 1 book in there that you wish to read, now you have another problem. You can't get another t-shirt and you don't want another book, so you have an idle resource. When you are in business, and this is what you're applying it to, you're trying to actually maximize your resources. So you want to be on that line. You can do the other things, but that means other resources are not being used. It's pretty inefficient. We'll talk about that in future chapters. Now we're on slide 14. Per capita income, just to give you an idea. We'll talk about gross domestic product a little later in chapter 5 or 6, I believe. How much stuff is made inside of a country's boundaries. You divide that by the number of people, that gives you your per capita income. In the U.S., as you can see, is right up there with a lot of wealthier countries. And then you go all the way down to the bottom, related to some poorer nations, Zimbabwe. That is not a misprint. $411 US per year. Just to give you an idea, if you are an international student listening to this and you happen to be in one of the countries that are doing well, count that as a blessing. Slide, and already discussed the budget line, resources. Problem with society, and we're on slide 15. One possible problem that you run into is how do you allocate the resources that you have, but what are the resources? And in your textbook, it's on page 7 to page 8. Primarily, we count three main resources: land, labor, and capital. Land or any natural resources, if that's coal or crude oil pulled from the ground, lumber, this ocean, those are just natural resources. Labor refers to anyone used to help make the final good at any stage. It's not always physical, but you need programmers, you need people that answer the phones and things like that. So anyone who helps contribute to the production of a good or service is part of labor. Capital, anything you use to make the final good or service. Usually it comes in the form of money. Money is given to a company, they turn that into capital, considering a machine to make out steel pipes or pizzas or t-shirts, anything of that nature. Last, entrepreneurial ability. Doesn't mean you're working for yourself. It refers to someone who's more of a risk taker, who's willing to go outside the norm, think outside the box. So these are all considered factors of production. The first three have been around for a while. Economic books recently have been adding an entrepreneurial spirit because it makes a difference. Again, we already talked about all things being equal. Well, somebody who might see an opportunity where others don't will probably figure out a way to take advantage of it. Production possibility, we discussed that briefly. Here, we're going to keep the model simple. Possibly, you have two things that you could make in a factory. We got, again, ceteris paribus, full employment, everything else stays the same. We're only going to talk about two options, something that we talked about a minute ago as far as the difference between the t-shirts and the pizza, the book. Here, however, you're in charge of making these goods. You can either make pizzas or industrial robots. If you're thinking that's quite a factory, I'm just following along what we have. Under this, you can either spend all of your resources going to A and make 10,000 robots, or E on the other extreme, and there you have roughly 400,000 pizzas. Or once you have the combination, again, trade-offs. You want more pizzas, you have to give up so many robots, and vice versa. The thing that you want to notice is anything under the graph line, you are not using all your resources to the maximum capabilities. W is someplace that you cannot obtain. You just don't have, again, those four factors of production to get to W. Now, in order to increase that, something has to change. And increasing some of those factors of production that we talked about. Now, as we talked about the other aspects of that, when do you stop certain bits of production? When the benefit and cost are equal, you generally stop. If we're looking at the red inclining line, if the cost is $15 and you only perceive $5 of benefit, you're probably not going to do it. So if that's the case, and you perceive C as the cost and D as the benefit, more than likely you are not going to do that. Again, if you're trying to understand how the world works from a business aspect, that's what it is. You're working somewhere, you have to figure out the general public. The cost is C. If they don't perceive the benefit above C, they're not going to do it. You'd ideally like to be cost is A, the cost is B, you're charging A. It's a low cost to you, marginal benefit to your consumer, they'll buy it. If it's C and D, you're probably not going to sell many units off the shelf. Other things that we focus on later on: unemployment, growth, and in the future, what possible aspects could come about. Again, as the economy tends to expand, more land, more labor, population growth, advances in technology, you'll see the curve expand outward generally. Then inside your textbook, briefly, we talk about two alternatives: what it is naturally growing, and if you have different aspects that may cause the curve to expand beyond what might normally be available. Increases in technology. Think of your cell phone. What can it do now? I'm old enough to remember when the cell phone did nothing but call people. Now look at it. And again, a nice, lovely little graph talking about other aspects as far as resources that are available. Then lightly, later on, we'll talk about international trade and how that affects the ability to actually have more resources. You're not limited by what you have locally. Last but not least, mistakes that are involved. Remember, you could probably be subject to these. We all are. You might be biased. The terms may be confusing. The fallacy of composition, meaning you're just grouping everybody together, and it's not that way. Post hoc, or after the fact, you start to make assumptions, and you believe something just because it happened in a certain way that they're related. They're not. Or they don't have to be all the time, I should say. Just because they may come together, may be correlated, it doesn't mean one causes the other. Pretty good read. I suggest going over that in the back of your chapter on that, page 14 and 15. All right. We'll get around to a second chapter. Hopefully that was helpful. Remember, have a good time studying, and I will see you in the next one.